Okay, this is part 35 of Nos4a2, Sugar Creek, Pennsylvania. Early in the summer of 2001, the news reached Bing Partridge that Charlie Mannix was bad sick. Bing was 53 by then and had not put his gas mask on in 5 years. Bing found out from an article on AOL, which he accessed using the big black Dell computer he had received from Norchem Farm for 30 years of service. He looked at AOL every day for news out of Colorado about Mr. Mannix, but there had been nothing for ages until this. Charles Talent Mannix III, age unknown, convicted murderer, suspect in dozens of children abductions, had been moved to the hospital wing of FCI Inglewood when it proved impossible to wake him up. Mannix was examined by prominent Denver neurosurgeon Mark Soffer, who described his condition as one for the medical books. The patient appears to suffer from adult progeria, or a rare form of Werner's syndrome, Soffer said. In the simplest terms, he has begun to age very rapidly. A month is more like a year for him. A year is close to a decade. And this guy was no spring chicken to begin with. The doctor said there was no way to tell if Mannix's condition could partially explain the aberrant behavior that led to his brutal slaying of PFC Thomas Priest in 1996. He also declined to describe Charlie Mannix's current state as a coma. He doesn't meet the strict definition of coma. His brain function is high, as if he's dreaming. He just can't wake up anymore. His body is too tired. He doesn't have any gas left in the tank. Bing had often thought of writing Mr. Mannix to tell him he was still faithful, still loved him, would always love him, would be there to serve him until the day he died. But while Bing was maybe not the shiniest bulb on the Christmas tree, he was smart enough to know that Mr. Mannix would be furious with him for writing and correct to be. A letter from Bing would for sure lead two men in suits knocking on the door, men in sunglasses with guns in armpit holsters. "Hello, Mr. Partridge. Would you mind answering a few questions? How would you feel about us planting a shovel in your basement, digging around for a bit?" So he had never written, and now it was too late, and the thought made him feel sick. Mr. Mannix had passed a message to Bing once, although by what means Bing didn't know. A package had been dropped on the doorstep with no return address on it 2 days after Mr. Mannix was sentenced to life in Inglewood. Inside were a pair of license plates, Nos4a2, Kansas, and a little card on ivory-laid stock with a Christmas angel stamped on the front. "Hold these. I might be a while. 9." Bing had the license plates in the root cellar, where all the rest of his life with Charlie Mannix was buried. The empty stolen tanks of sevoflurane, his daddy's 45, and the remains of the women, the mothers that Bing had brought home with him after many a mission of salvation with Mr. Mannix. 9 missions in all. Brad McCulty had been the 9th child they had saved for Christmasland, and his mother, Cynthia, the last whore Bing had dealt with in the quiet room downstairs. In a way, she had been saved as well. Before she died, Bing had taught her about love. Bing and Mr. Mannix had planned to save one more child in the summer of 1997, and that time Bing would go all the way to Christmasland with Mr. Mannix, to live where no one grew old and unhappiness was against the law, where he could ride all the rides and drink all the cocoa and open Christmas gifts every morning. When he thought about the cosmic unfairness of it, of Mr. Mannix being ripped away right before he could swing wide the gates of Christmasland to let Bing at last, he felt smashed inside, as if hope were a vase that had been dropped from a height. Crunch. The worst of it, though, was not losing Mr. Mannix or losing Christmasland. It was losing love. It was losing the mommies. His last, Mrs. McNulty, had been the best. They had long talks in the basement together. Mrs. McNulty, naked and tanned and fit, clasped against Bing's side. She was 40, but stringy with muscle that she had built up coaching girls volleyball. Her skin radiated heat and health. She stroked the graying hair on Bing's chest and told him she loved him better than her mother or father, better than Jesus, better than her own son, better than kittens, better than sunshine. It felt good to hear her say it. I love you, Bing Partridge. I love you so much it's burning me. I'm all kindling inside. It's burning me alive. Her breath had been sweet with the smell of the gingerbread smoke. She was so fit and so healthy. He had to dose her with his flavored sovoflorin mix once every 3 hours. She loved him so much she cut her own wrist when he told her they couldn't live together. They made love one last time while she bled all over him. Does it hurt? He asked. Oh, Bing, you silly thing, she said. I've been burning with love for days. A couple little cuts like these, they don't hurt at all. She was so pretty, had such perfect mommy tits. He couldn't bear to pour the lie on her until she began to smell. Even with flies in her hair, she was pretty, extra pretty, really. The blue bottles glistened like gems. Bing had visited the graveyard of what might be with Mr. Mannix, and knew that if Cynthia McNulty had been left to her own devices, she would have killed her son in a steroid-fueled rage. But down in his quiet room, Bing had taught her kindness and love and how to suck cock, so at least she ended her life on a good note. That was what it was all about, taking something awful and making something good of it. Mr. Mannix saved the children and Bing saved the mommies. Now, though, the mommies were over and done. Mr. Mannix was locked up, gone, and Bing's gas mask hung on a hook behind the door where it had been since 1996. He read the story in the news about Mr. Mannix falling asleep, into a deep, endless sleep, a brave soldier under a wicked enchantment, and then printed it and folded it and decided to pray on it some. In his 53rd year, Bing Partridge had become a church-going man once again, had returned to the New American Faith Tabernacle in hopes that God would offer some comfort for one of his loneliest children. Bing prayed that one day he would hear White Christmas playing in the driveway and would push back the linen curtain and see Mr. Mannix behind the wheel of the Wraith. The window rolled down and the good man gazing out at him. Come on, Bing, let's go for a ride. Number 10 is waiting for us. Let's go grab one more kid and take you to Christmasland. Heaven knows you've earned it. He climbed the steep hill in the smothering heat of a July afternoon. The foil flowers in his front yard, 29 of them, were perfectly still and silent. He hated them. He hated the blue sky, too, and the maddening harmonic of the cicadas throbbing in the trees. Bing trudged up the hill with the news story in one hand, rare condition befalls convicted murderer, and Mr. Mannix's final note in the other, I might be a while, 9, to speak to God about these things. The church stood in a hectare of buckled blacktop, shoots of pale grass as high as Bing's knees sticking up through the cracks. A loop of heavy-duty chain and a Yale lock held the front door shut. No one except for Bing himself had prayed there for going on 15 years. The tabernacle had belonged to the Lord once, but now it was property of the money-lenders. A sun-faded sheet of paper in a clear plastic envelope tacked to one of the doors said so. The cicadas buzzed in Bing's head like madness. Out at one end of the lot was a big sign like they'd have put out in front of a Dairy Queen or a used car lot telling people which hymn they'd be singing that day. Only in God, and He's alive again, and the Lord never sleeps, devotions, were promised for 1 p.m. The sign had been promising those same hymns since Reagan's second term. Some of the stained glass windows had holes where kids had chucked rocks in them, but Bing didn't climb in that way. There was a shed out to one side of the church, half hidden back in the dusty poplars and sumac. A rotting cord doormat lay in front of the shed's door. A bright brass key was hidden beneath it. The key opened the padlock on the slip cellar doors at the back of the building. Bing let himself below. He crossed a cool subterranean room, wading through the smell of old creosote and millweed books, and came up into the big open theater of the church. Bing had always liked church, back in the day when he still went with his mother. He had liked the way the sun came through the 20-foot-high stained glass windows, filling the room with warmth and color, and he had liked the way the mommies dressed, in white lace and heels and milky white stockings. Bing loved white stockings and loved to hear a woman sing. All the mommies who stayed with him in the house of sleep sang before they took their last rest. But after the pastor ran away with the whole treasury and the bank locked the church up, Bing found that the place troubled him. He did not like the way the shadow of the steeple seemed to reach for his house in the light of day. Bing found, after he started taking mommies back to his home, a place Mr. Mannix had christened the House of Sleep, he could hardly stand to look at the top of the hill any more. The church loomed, the shadow of the steeple, an accusing finger that stretched down the slope and pointed at his front yard. Here is a deadly killer, 9 dead women in his basement. Bing tried to tell himself he was being foolish. He and Mr. Mannix were heroes. Really, they did Christian work. If someone wrote a book about them, you would have to mark them down as the good guys. It did not matter that many of the mothers, when dosed with sevoflurane, would still not admit to their plans to whore their daughters or beat their sons, and that several contended they had never taken drugs, did not drink to excess, and did not have criminal records. Those things were in the future, a wretched future that Bing and Mr. Mannix worked hard to prevent. If he was ever arrested, because of course no lawman would ever understand the importance and basic goodness of their vocation, Bing felt he could talk about his work with pride. There was no shame in him about any of the things he had done with Mr. Mannix. Still, he occasionally had trouble looking up at the church. He told himself as he climbed the steps from the basement that he was being a ninny, that all men were welcome in God's house, and Mr. Mannix needed Bing's prayers now more than ever. For himself, Bing had never felt so alone or forlorn. A few weeks earlier, Mr. Paladin had asked Bing what he was going to do with himself after he retired. Bing was shocked and asked why he would retire. He liked his job. Mr. Paladin blinked and said after 40 years they would make him retire. You didn't get a choice in the matter. Bing had never thought about it. He had assumed that by now he would be drinking cocoa in Christmasland, opening presents in the morning, singing carols in the night. The vast empty sanctuary did not put his mind at ease that afternoon. Just the opposite, in fact. All the pews were still there, although they were no longer lined up in neat rows, but had been shoved this way and that, were as crooked as Mr. Mannix's teeth. The floor was littered with broken glass and chunks of plaster, which crunched underfoot. The room smelled rankly of ammonia, of bird piss. Someone had been in here drinking. The bottles and beer cans left behind littered the pews. He went on, pacing the length of the room. His passage disturbed the shallows in the rafters. The sound of their beating wings echoed, a noise like a magician spraying playing cards into the air. The light that slanted in through the windows was cold and blue, and motes of dust turned within the bars of sunshine as if the church were the interior of a snow globe just beginning to settle. Someone, teenagers, homeless, had made an altar in one of the deep-set window frames. Deformed red candles stood in hardened puddles of wax, and set behind the candles were several photographs of Michael Stipe from REM, a scrawny queer with pale hair and pale eyes. Someone had written, "Losing my religion," on one of the photographs in cherry lipstick. Bing himself felt there had not been a single thing worth listening to in rock music since Abbey Road. Bing set the card from Mr. Mannix in the printout from the Denver Post in the center of this homemade altar and lit a couple candles for the good man. He cleared some space on the floor, kicking aside chunks of broken plaster and a dirty pair of panties, little hearts on them, looked like they could fit a 10-year-old, and got on his knees. He cleared his throat. In the vast echoing space of the church it sounded as loud as a gunshot. A swallow rattled its wings, gliding from one rafter to another. He could see a line of pigeons leaning forward to stare down at him with their bright, rabies-red eyes. They watched him with fascination. He shut his eyes and put his hands together and spoke with God. "Hey there, God," Bing said. "It's Bing, that old dumb thing. Oh, God. Oh, God, God, God. Please help Mr. Mannix. Mr. Mannix has the sleepies. Bad. And I don't know what to do. And if he doesn't get better and come back to me, I'll never have my trip to Christmasland. I tried my best to do something good with my life. I tried my best to save children and make sure they'd have cocoa and rides and things. It wasn't easy. No one wanted us to save them. And even when the mommies screamed and called us awful names, even when their children cried and wet themselves, I loved them. I loved those kids, and I loved their mommies, even if they were bad women. And I loved Mr. Mannix most of all. Everything he does so other people can be happy. Isn't that the kindest thing a person can do? Spread a little happiness around? Please, God, if we did any good at all, please help me. Give me a sign. Tell me what to do. Please, 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 please. His face was tipped back and his mouth was open when something hot hit his cheek and he tasted something salty and bitter on his lips. He flinched. It was like someone had come on him. He swiped at his mouth and looked at his fingers, now coated with a whitish-green crud, a sloppy liquid mash. It took a moment to identify it as pigeon shit. Bing groaned once, then again. His mouth was full of the salt cream taste of bird shit. The stuff cupped in his palm looked like diseased phlegm. His moaning rose to a scream, and he pitched himself backward, kicking plaster and glass, and put his other hand down on something damp and sticky with the soft texture of saran wrap. He glanced down and discovered he had planted his hand on a soiled condom crawling with ants. He lifted his hand in horror, in revulsion, and the condom stuck to his fingers, and he flicked his hand once, twice, and it flipped up and landed in his hair. He shrieked. Birds exploded from the rafters. "What?" he screamed to the church. "What? I came here on my knees. I came here on my knees. And you do what? What?" He grabbed the rubber and yanked, tearing out a fistful of his own wispy gray hair at the same time. When had it all turned gray? Dust swirled in the light. Bing Partridge went down the hill in a shambling jog, feeling defiled, ill, and outraged. He reeled like a drunk past the foil flowers in his front yard and banged the door shut behind him. It was the gas mask man who stepped out 20 minutes later, a bottle of lighter fluid in each hand. Before he lit the place up, he boarded over the holes in the windows so the birds couldn't get out. He drizzled most of one bottle over the pews and the heaps of broken wood and plaster on the floor. Perfect little pre-made bonfires. The other bottle he emptied on the figure of Jesus, mounted on his cross up at the apse. He looked cold in his little loincloth, so Bing flicked a match and dressed him in a robe of flame. Mary gazed sadly down at his latest indignity inflicted upon her son from a mural above him. Bing tapped 2 fingers to the mouthpiece of his mask, blew her a kiss. Gave him a chance to grab child number 10 with Mr. Mannix, Bing thought, and he didn't care if he had to gas and kill Christ's own mama to get the little bastard. Besides, there wasn't anything the Holy Ghost had done in Mother Mary's pussy that Bing couldn't have done better if he had 3 days alone with her in the house of sleep.